So welcome everybody. We have an interesting meeting today. We're going to talk about two books that Bill Nowlin's been involved in the baseball biggest blowout games, and then his Working a Perfect Game. The biggest blowout game sounds like a very interesting project, and it should be an interesting book to read. Hopefully I can find time for it, but it sounds very interesting. I'm not going to mute everybody initially if we don't have an issue. We're at about, I think, 18 people on here. If it becomes noisy, I will mute everybody except for the speakers. Let's see how that can go. If we have questions that can maybe be asked easier that way. Otherwise, also use the chat feature. I will pay attention to that as well. To start the meeting, I'd like to have Mary Shea, who's heads our book club, to talk about our next book and some interesting news on our next book club meeting. Mary?
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. This is the next book. I'll try to, the Big Fella by Jane Levy. Is it Levy or Levy? Does anybody know?
Levy.
I think it's Levy.
Levy, okay. And she's a nationally acclaimed, I'm sorry?
It is Levy.
Yeah, okay, thank you. She's a nationally acclaimed author and writer for the Washington Post. She wrote a book on Sandy Koufax and a book on Mickey Mantle. And this looks to be, I'm just 50 pages in it, and it's incredible. So our next book club meeting will be December 9th. It's a Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central. And thanks to Mike Hoppert, who arranged to have Jane Levy join us for the meeting. So we are very, very excited about that, to have her insight into the book and other things about Babe Ruth, probably arguably one of the most interesting characters in baseball history. So if you have any questions, you can message us at the Ken Keltner Facebook page. A lot of you probably get our newsletters. So again, December 9th, for those, I don't know how many people are in Milwaukee, you can get it at Boswell Books or Amazon or other booksellers. So any questions? Otherwise, that's it. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mike, for helping get Jane to show up for our meeting. I heard her on Rob Neyer's podcast, SABRcast, and she was excellent. She's a very, very interesting person with a very strong background. So I'm looking forward to that meeting. I wasn't sure I wanted to read Big Fellas. I think I've read enough Babe Ruth, though I need to read more, but this book I know is different. And from that standpoint, it sounds pretty exciting.
And thanks for the tip on Rob Neyer. I love Rob Neyer, and I forget to listen, and I'll have to check that out. So thank you.
Yeah, it was a while ago. It was sometime. It might have been earlier this year, but yeah, it's a ways back. But yeah, she was pretty good. Okay, so we're here to talk about what I think we billed this as two Bill Nowlin books, and the first one is going to be about baseball's biggest blowout game, SABR's latest book. Bill was the editor on that, and this book is a tale of the most lopsided games in Major League history. I don't think I've ever been to one of those games, but had I been, it'd probably been a Brewers loss in the 70s. So but I don't think I've ever had any of that. The book includes each franchise's top 4 blowouts, as well as the top 6 in the postseason. In addition to Bill, joining him is Andres Koskinen, who was the team captain for the Brewers blowouts. Is that correct?
Yes.
James?
Yep.
Okay. And Herb Wilson, and the other William, who goes by Tom Hawthorne, who were authors on the book. And then
and also Blake Sherry.
Okay. You see that? Cool. Thank you, Blake. So I'm going to turn this over to Bill Pearch. We have another Bill going to talk a little about the book and do so and get us started on the conversation. Bill?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having us today. I am the chair of SABR's new publication marketing committee, and I get the chance to work with Bill Nowlin. So it's fantastic to hear about these books. in advance before coming out, really while they're still in production, and getting a sense of the stories that they're telling. And obviously, if you're a SABR member, you're probably familiar with the books and the publication program. If you're not, or you just want to get a little refresher, please go to sabr.org, click the link for publications, and you'll see the comprehensive list. And again, if you're a member, you can get an e-version of the book for free. And you can also get hard copy books printed on demand for a small cost. And they're absolutely fantastic. They're all put together by SABR members. The topics range, again, from something like we're talking about today, specific games where there are blowouts. They can be individual players. They can be great teams from the past, and even some ballpark specific projects. And I really have a good sense of the appreciation that goes into the amount of work that goes into these books being produced. I've been fortunate enough to contribute to a couple of my own, some a little more Chicago specific, as I'm from the Emil Roth chapter, just a little south of you guys. But it's fantastic, and really what we're trying to do is generate a little bit more discussion around these books. And thank you again for this opportunity to talk about them. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our esteemed editor and board member, Bill Nowlin.
Thank you, Bill. I was trying to think as I was preparing for today, I was trying to remember where the idea for this book came from, and I can't remember. It just came up somehow. The next book we have coming out is Baseball's Greatest Comeback Games. That one kind of followed this one in some ways, but it's just, I guess, a way of looking at different games that were unusual in one way or another. And we're determined by run differential. Talk about what were the biggest blowout games. Well, it's the number of runs that one team has over another. There was a 30-3 game just not that many years ago. It's 27 runs between the winning team and the losing team. That's definitely a blowout game. The one featured on the cover is when my Boston Red Sox, my adopted Boston Red Sox, beat the St. Louis Browns 29-4. And that was kind of an interesting game because the day before they beat them 20-4. I mean, unbelievable. 49-8 over a 2-game stretch. It wasn't a doubleheader. They were back-to-back games, but the St. Louis Browns were not at the top of their game at that stretch. And that year's Red Sox set an all-time record for the franchise, driving in over 100 runs during a 154-game season, averaging more than 6 runs a game. But this was obviously far above average in terms of the number of runs. It was a game I went to not that many years ago, 2004. It was game 3 of the American League Championship Series. It just came up in the news recently because of Tampa Bay versus Houston. The Yankees won game 1 of the ALCS that year. The Yankees beat the Red Sox in game 2 of the ALCS that year. And then they won game 3, 19-8. That was a little discouraging, losing the first 3 games of a 7-game series. But something happened, and things turned around. The Red Sox actually went on to win the first World Series in 86 years. So I was at that 19-8 game. I was going with my son to game 4. And I said to myself and to him that I didn't want to, he was, what was he? He was 13 at the time. I said, I don't want to traumatize you for life. How about I just sell the tickets to somebody else and we'll just pass this game. And in fact, they won in extra innings. It was a very exciting game. I missed that one. But then I got to game 5 and things were okay from that point on. I don't know. It's just, they're either great games, a blowout game, or terrible games, depending on partly whether you're the winner or the loser. If you go to a game and your team is losing 29-4, well, that's kind of discouraging. You might not stay for the whole game. If you are the winner, maybe you get gorged on excitement from seeing your team cross the plate over and over and over again. Though there are many of us that consider ourselves baseball purists, then we would rather have a game, as I mentioned in the introduction, like the game in the World Series, Red Sox versus Dodgers just a couple of years ago. It was, how many innings did it go? 18 innings, and the Dodgers won 3-2. I was up till whatever that was, 3 o'clock in the morning. People in California had to stay up after midnight to watch the World Series game. It was astonishing. What dedication. But it was after 3 o'clock, and I'm not sure I got a lot of sleep for a little while after that either. Pardon?
How do I get the, wait a minute.
Oh.
I know.
Yeah.
If you somebody has a question, maybe put it on the chat and maybe somebody can help you. Well, I also don't know where the idea came from for team captains, but at some point what I decided was that we should have, this book should represent each one of the 30 current major league franchises. And I figured, okay, well, let's pick the 4 biggest blowouts for each franchise and find somebody that knows the team in question that could make those selections, partly, mainly based mathematically. I mean, to some extent, the selections were already made, but to write an introduction. In this discussion here today, we'll focus on the Milwaukee Brewers, and Andres Koskinen was the volunteered to be the team captain for the Brewers. So the games were pretty much selected, although there were a couple of cases where we could have gone one way or another and had to make a decision between whatever it was, 2 16-run or 17-run differential games and pick one or pick the other. And so we made some choices in that regard. With the Pirates, I remember there were quite a few games where their biggest blowouts were in the 19th century. And we just decided, well, let's start with 1901 and feature the games that were, that we all remember from 1902 and 1903, that era. And anyhow, let me turn it over to Andres, who maybe can tell us a little bit about the Brewers and their history of blowout games. And then in turn, we have 3 other nationally acclaimed authors here as well who wrote different Brewers games up.
Yeah, thank you. So I hopped in kind of late to this project. So as Bill said, the games had already been selected. But in my hunting around and doing the introduction, it was very nice to see, as I'm sure all of you know, for a team that's pretty long suffering, to have a winning record in games decided by 10 runs is something we can stick in the eye of everybody else. So at the time I wrote it, it was a .523 winning percentage, going 124 and 113 in such games. Been a little bit on the downslide in 2019 and 2020. We've gone 3-6 over the last 2 years, but still holding on to our winning record in these blowout games. So the first 3 were easy to pick because numerically it went 2 games that the Brewers won by 20 runs, 1 by 18, and then we had 2 games where the Brewers won by 17 runs. One was in 1980 against Bills Red Sox. So that's why that game didn't get picked.
Oh yeah, right.
And the other was against the Cubs in 2010. And of the 3 games that had already been selected, there was one against the Red Sox and one that had been played in 2010. My justification in the introduction is, well, it's more impressive to have 2 huge wins in the same year, and you can't resist picking on the Cubs either.
So thank you.
Well, if Cole Hamels hadn't been, so there is no rivalry, it would have been easier to pass on that. Yeah, so that's kind of most of what I wrote about in the introduction, kind of just going over like all heartbreaks through the years, and it's nice to have something where we're better than average. And then I wrote about the Cubs game. Was kind of my involvement in this. So Bill just sent out a series of emails like, hey, I need team captains for this. These are the first 2 articles I wrote for SABR. It sounded like a fun project, and it's always nice to get your name in a book, especially for me coming out of journalism school. It's nice to have publications to put on my resume.
Yeah. You enjoy the process of doing it.
Yeah, it was fun. And the editors and fact checkers, I'm sure, have a heck of a time crunching all these numbers, but they did an excellent job. And it's much less confrontational than my normal workday when there's fact checking going on.
If we didn't have some of the great fact checkers we have, we'd be in bad shape. I mean, I just wrote up a game. I got it back yesterday. I had 5 errors and 1,500 words. We rely on these fact checkers. They just, excellent. So who was that? Let's see, Tom, you wrote up the biggest blowout. It was a 22-2 game in 1992 in Toronto. Why don't you tell us about that game? Maybe a little bit about the game, how you researched it, but the game itself, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So I'll just introduce myself briefly to people. I'm joining you from Victoria, British Columbia, which is on Vancouver Island. We're just slightly northwest of Seattle, if you're trying to think of where we are on the map. And although it's Canada, we're kind of both in Blue Jays and Mariners country out here. I happen to be a member of Expos Nation, just because of my age and because I was a boy in Montreal when the team arrived. And I've written for a number of these books, several of them edited by Bill. If members of the chapter haven't had a chance to do so, I strongly encourage you to think about contributing to a book. It's a really great process, and it's an opportunity to do a deep dive into a game or to a player. So on this game, I signed up for it. I had been on the Blue Jays beat in the late 80s when I was living in Toronto for the Toronto Globe and Mail. I was the number 2 or 3 guy, the utility infielder helping out Larry Milson, a very famous baseball writer out of Toronto. And so I had covered some of these players. So the game takes place at Sky Dome. It's late in August. The Brewers are in 3rd place going into this game, and they've just had a really bad patch. And so typically coming out of this, I think they were about 4.5. It's in my article. They're 4.5 or 5.5 games behind the Jays. The Tigers are in between them. And so this is a game that's going to, have some, import to the standings. The big news in Toronto was that they had just got David Cone from the Yankees, and he arrives. This is the first game he's going to be on the Jays bench. And of course, the new pitcher, they have him chart this game. So it turns out he has his work cut out for him. So for a blowout game, I actually found this one, I'm sure it's of great satisfaction to any Brewers fan, but as a blowout game, it was kind of a dull one in the sense that there was no ridiculous inning. There was no 10-run inning or 12-run inning. It was a game where the Brewers just constantly, every inning, put up hits and scored runs. They scored in 8 of the 9 innings. Their best inning was a 6-run inning, which isn't all that rare, but just lopped them up. So 2 in the first, 1 in the second, 4 in the third. They had the big inning in the 4th with 6. So they're up 13-1 after 4. And then they go quietly in the 5th inning. And so it just looks like it's going to be an easy game. But then they keep, again, rolling up those hits. A run in the 6th. 2 in the 7th, 3 in the 8th, and another 3 in the 9th. So by the end, it's all done. You start adding it up, and it's 22-2 is the final score. There's only 1 home run hit as well. So that's a real oddity for a 22-run game, and especially at Sky, which is fairly conducive to home runs. And I guess that was hit by Paul Molitor. Just check. Yeah, and it was his. He hit it in the first inning. So the starter for the Jays was Jimmy Key, the left-hander out of Alabama. Pretty good pitcher, not having a great year. He was 8-11 going into this game. He doesn't last long. It's a quick. I've seen some quick games by Jimmy Key. They usually end differently than that. So, and he was the first of 6 victims that were hauled in there. And as I said, like the Brewers just constantly and consistently hit. Kevin Seitzer had 5 hits. Scott Fletcher had 5 hits. Darryl Hamilton put up 4 hits. Pat Listach, the leadoff batter, had 4 hits. And so they just kind of constantly, consistently rolled up the hits, one after the other. at the end of the game, Key said, whoever we threw out there in terms of pitchers, they hit. And I think the Jays had 6 pitchers in total. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep. David Wells was the closer in the game. And everybody was touched. So for the Brewers, just a fun game for them to be in the lineup. The pitchers had no trouble. Cal Eldred was your starter in that game. And most of the coverage, certainly in Toronto, was about David Cohn's arrival. They kind of sloughed off the big game and talked about David Cohn and Jimmy Key. So they even asked Jimmy Key in the dressing room after the game. So what kind of impression have you made on David Cohn? He's just arrived, going to be your big pitcher going into the playoffs, perhaps. And Jimmy Key says, I guess he's thinking tough league. We'll have to ice his wrist down after that one. And so essentially he'd been charting the pitches. There's well over, I have the total in the article here, how many pitches, just a ridiculous number of pitches the Jays pitchers threw. And they had him stop after 5 innings because there was no point charting anymore after that. Limited coverage in the Milwaukee papers because they were on the road, I guess. And this is something you see more these days where there's not as many reporters covering it. So a lot of the Milwaukee papers actually use the wire services. So
I'm
that's
kind
just
of curious about
quick
one thing,
summation.
Tom. I noticed that all 4 of these games were road games, as it happens. Every single one of the 4 biggest blowouts were on the road. Do you, and this will be true with the other authors also, we'll go to Blake next. Any of you have any sense of how well what the attendance was like when you got into the 7th and 8th innings, maybe at the top of the 9th inning? Had people emptied out? Did you get any sense of that from the articles?
No, I didn't. It was because it was a game with pennant race importance. There were more than 50,000 people at Sky Dome.
Oh wow!
So that's a big attendance. Toronto baseball fans can be fair weather fans, so and leaving the stadium can be a hassle, even though it's on quite close to a subway line. So I'm sure it had thinned out by then. The one thing I have included in my article, so you always want to personalize or humanize, and I go through. So Bill, you had asked how you do the research on these books. One of the things I always like to do is get every newspaper clipping I can get my hands on. So find out who covered a game, get the coverage from the hometown paper, the visiting paper, what did the Associated Press, or up in Canada, the Canadian Press, report on the game. And in the Toronto Star, they had a little item on a fellow by the name of Arthur Kineski, who was a retired poultry farmer. And in the middle of the game, he was introduced on the scoreboard because he was celebrating his 104th birthday at the ballpark. So for me, that helped tie in this ancient baseball fan at age 104. He was somebody who was in attendance at that game, who had actually been alive in 1909 when the New York Giants had 31 hits. And this is the first time that had happened. And so I did further research to find out when this fellow had passed away. And he, in fact, had lived long enough to be alive when the Jays went on this season to win the World Series. So it was just, you look for those little gems. That actually, the Toronto Star didn't make a big deal of this fellow. It was just like a notebook item at the end of a column. And I just thought, oh, okay, that is interesting, because here's a span from 1909 to this game in 1992.
Mm-hmm. So Blake, why don't you tell us about the game you wrote up?
First, let me explain why I even picked it. I mean, normally I'm all things Pittsburgh, and I think by the time I found out about the book, all the Pirate games were picked, except for this one Milwaukee game where they beat the Pirates. So I thought, well, being a humble guy that I am, I will go ahead and write about my Buccos getting destroyed. Back during 2010, I mean, that's not that uncommon. I mean, we were toward the tail end of our 20 consecutive years of losing seasons, so the expectation was a bit low, but you still don't expect a blowout. when I started to research the game, I mean, looking at Milwaukee and national papers, you know, the headlines included blowout and hit parade, and making a play on how they battered the Pirates. In Pittsburgh, the papers definitely use things like embarrassment, that they were going to hit the road the next day, and they just hoped that, quote, the road wouldn't hit back, which I kind of liked. And then a sidebar article about the rotation needing an upgrade. So it was things weren't great. Actually, to answer the question, it was a Thursday noon game, 12:30 game. There was only 13,000 to start with. So I'm not sure how many were still there. Although the one thing that the Pittsburgh papers did talk about in the ninth, because it was 10-0 after 5. And in the 7th inning, the Brewers got another 6 runs. So certainly by the 7th inning stretch, the game, you know, I would think people would have started leaving, but maybe they came in town for a Penguin playoff game that day or something, which is where the interest would have been in Pittsburgh at that point. But in the 9th, they did score 4 runs, and the papers did report that while people were booing in the 7th, as they approached that 20th run, they did a kind of a sarcastic cheer. And this was written by the Pittsburgh beat writer, which I got a kick out of. Some other takeaways from the game that I just kind of found interesting and think were noteworthy. For the Pirates, at least, it was the worst loss in their 124-year history. It still remains the worst loss of the team history. And we already covered that the Brewers ended up winning later in August 18-1. So they did have those 2 blowouts that year. The Pirates used 6 pitchers. The starter from Milwaukee, he went 6 innings and did really well. Ryan Braun was probably the hitting star, although there were several guys. Edmonds, Ricky Weeks all had 3 hits. Prince Fielder had 2 hits, but 1 was a home run. Ryan Braun had 5 RBI. So if when you have that many guys with that many hits, you probably say who drove in the most runs. Surprisingly, and the Pirates were not a great fielding team during that period of time. There was only 1 error in the game, which kind of surprised me. If you're going to give up 20 runs, you had expected sloppier fielding, but really it was the Brewers just hitting the ball. And in the comments from certainly some of the Pirate players, as well as the Brewers players, they just talked about the Brewers talked about how fat the pitches were looking and just everything was finding holes. And the Pirates said, everything we threw, I felt like I was throwing batting practice. The starter, which was Dan McCutcheon, he said, I felt like I was throwing batting practice. They were just teeing off on me so much. My favorite quote of the game came from Jim Edmonds, who had 3 hits and drove in 3 runs as well. He said it was kind of an awkward game. Based on his response, it sounded like they asked him about, those last 4 runs in the 9th. And his comment was, it's an awkward place. He says, because you have to keep playing and you have to, you can't lay off because you have to respect the game. And sometimes you hear that, particularly in football games. It's like you can't just quit playing. You can put in substitutes, but they still are trying to play and they're still trying to make a name for themselves. But here's this group of guys, and I thought that was kind of a classy way of talking about that, and I found it interesting. The other thing with the Brewers and Pirates at that time, the surprising thing with this being a blowout in Pittsburgh is that in Milwaukee, the Pirates were in the midst of a 21 game losing streak in Milwaukee. And actually, I think it was a week later, the very next road trip, they had to go back into Milwaukee. Milwaukee only beat them by 14 runs in the first game of the series the following week, and then they actually won a game. So the streak ended at 21 games in Milwaukee, but they certainly had their number during that period of time. I think those were the highlights. Those were the highlights.
Good. How about Herb?
Yeah. Hi, folks. So I did a blowout game with the Red Sox at Fenway Park. I live in Maine, and so I came at this project from the perspective of a Red Sox fan. And this particular game was on Patriots Day. Patriots Day is the third Monday in April, as you may know. It's a state holiday in Maine and in Massachusetts. It's a really big sports day in Massachusetts because it not only is there's always a Red Sox home game that day, but it's also the Boston Marathon. And at this time, in 1990, the Boston Marathon was started so that it would finish in downtown Boston right about when the ball game was over. So the Red Sox fans could all come out and cheer on the marathoners as they finished up their race. It's an unusual game on Patriots Day because it always starts at 11 in the morning. So this was an 11 a.m. Start. And the Red Sox had gotten off to a pretty good start. This was April 16th of 1990. They had won 4 out of the 5 games so far. And there were questions about their pitching, how deep their pitching was. They had Clemens and they had Boddicker. And Boddicker, in fact, was scheduled, did in fact pitch that day against Teddy Higuera of Milwaukee. And the first inning went fine. But then the Brewers lit off on Boddicker and scored 4 runs, double by Parker, double by Greg Brock, and they didn't stop. They started the next inning and they scored 3 more runs. They knocked Boddicker out after 2 1/3. Dennis Lamp comes in, doesn't do much better. He allows a few more runs in the third, and then 3 more runs in the fourth, so he gets booted out as well. So we've had 3 2/3 pitchers so far. And then they brought in this fellow, Dana Kiker, who was only in the majors for 2 years, and he pretty much shut the Brewers down for the next 3.5 innings, or 3.1 innings. But this was a game where there was not a single home run, despite the fact that 18 runs were scored and 20 hits were garnered. It was truly a team effort. Every one of the starting players got at least 1 hit. Dave Parker had 3 doubles. Greg Brock had 2 doubles. Greg Vaughn had 2 doubles. And Gary Sheffield had 2 doubles. And then we'll throw in a triple by B.J. Surhoff, and all the rest were singles. We had there were a number of players that got on by either by walks or by hit by pitch, or in one case by reaching on an error. But as I said, Kiker pretty much shut the Brewers down until the 7th inning, and then they erupted again, scoring 8 more runs in the 7th and 8th, or the 7th and 8th innings. And Higuera was taken out after 6 1/3, so clearly earned the win that day. It was fun, as others have talked about, checking out the newspaper accounts, what the local sports writers thought. And I suppose in some ways it was lucky that this game happened to occur on Patriots Day, because a number of the Boston Globe and other newspaper people had the day off, so the coverage wasn't as thorough. And also there was the competing event of the Boston Marathon, so there was relatively little in the papers about the game. It was enough. And the most telling comment was when Larry Whiteside, he wrote that this was no ordinary mugging. It was one of total embarrassment, the worst shutout for Boston Red Sox in 35 years, and that in fact was true. But the Red Sox picked themselves up, and they were nip and tuck with Toronto over the course of June and July for the American League East lead, and they finally claimed the lead for good on July 9th. And went on and lost to the, as they had done in 1988, they lost in 1990 to the Oakland A's, and so they didn't make it to the World Series then. I was also amused because I didn't realize that Terry Francona was playing for the Brewers when they came to town, and he came in to replace Brock as a defensive replacement later in the game, as if they needed a defensive replacement at that point. But anyway, it was just 14 years later that Francona was on that field in a very different sort of situation when the Red Sox finally broke the curse.
Well, great. One of the things that's interesting about the Patriots day games is they do start at 11 or 11:05. That means that media tends to get there about 8 o'clock in the morning to prepare for the game. It's a little unusual for sports reporters to be getting to events at 8 o'clock in the morning or earlier.
Yeah.
Early.
Yeah, so there was no game. There was no game on
we're
Sunday.
more accustomed to going to bed at that time than
Yes.
actually going up to the ballpark.
Right. Maybe some people stayed up from the night before. These days, of course, after the 2013 bombing of the Boston Marathon, when you leave the ballpark after the Patriots Day game and go down to watch the runners come through, you have to go through a security check to get right up to where the runners go by. It's just 3 blocks away, but it's well organized for obvious reasons. So Anders, do you want to, you talked a little bit before, but do you want to talk about your game in particular, the second blowout game from 2010, right?
Yeah, I can go through it a little bit. I'm a little shocked that I'm the only actual Brewers fan who in this section.
Yeah.
So this was in early August of 2010. The Brewers and the Cubs were both pretty far back in the division race, something like 11 and 13 games back respectively. And both of them had come in on like a 5-game losing streak, or like 5 out of the last 6. So on the down tread, even in the midst of losing seasons. So it was Giovanni Gallardo versus Randy Wells. And Gallardo ended up going 6 innings and striking out 12, which is why I put that in the title of my column here. Gallardo's 12 Ks overshadowed as Brewers pummel Cubs 18-1, because I don't think anybody really cared how many people struck out once they realized what the margin of the victory was. But what I found very interesting about this is the game was actually scoreless all the way through the end of the 3rd inning. So the Brewers piled on 18 runs in the last 6 innings on only 1 home run. So they scored 1 run for every out that the Cubs were able to record the rest of the game. Braun and Fielder both had 5 hits, and Corey Hart had 4. And there was 2 instances where Hart, Braun, and Fielder went back to back to back with hits, and Fielder and Braun did that 3 times. So the Brewers opened the scoring in the 4th inning, getting 5 runs off of Randy Wells. Alan Trammell was managing the Cubs at the time because Lou Piniella had been suspended after kicking dirt on an umpire. So he sent Randy Wells back out for the 4th inning for some reason, where he gave up 2 more singles and then a couple more hits off of Justin Berg, and some errors. Ended up with 5 more runs in the 5th inning, at which point going into the 6th, they turned it over to Casey Coleman, who was making his major league debut for the Cubs. He was also a 3rd-generation baseball player. Both his dad and his grandpa played in MLB as well.
Oh,
He was the first 3rd-generation pitcher, because both of his predecessors had also been pitchers. And I found it funny too that Casey Coleman debuted pitching against Casey McGee and chewed a walk to him. So that was a good start. He ended up going 2 1/3 innings, giving up 6 runs, all of them earned, on a grand total of 63 pitches. So an inauspicious start to a career. But yeah, this was a relatively well spread out score sheet for the Brewers. I think it was 10 different Brewers ended up getting a hit. Trevor Hoffman actually had an at-bat. I think it was the last of his career. So he didn't get a hit, but every position player who got an at-bat ended up with a hit. Fielder led the way with 5 RBIs. McGee had 4. He was the guy who hit the home run, 3-run shot in the 4th, I believe. Couple hit by pitches, 2 errors, a bunch of walks, and they ended up with a total of 26 hits, which also matched the Milwaukee Braves back in the 50s when they came to Chicago. Also ended up pounding on the Cubs at Wrigley.
23-10.
Yeah. And I did most of my research by watching a WGN broadcast of the game, so from the Cubs perspective, and then supplemented that with Associated Press and some other article trimmings. But I realized how talented Bob Uecker is at making blowout games seem interesting, because the Cubs announcers just suffered through the last 4 innings or so once it got to 10-1 and worse. At some point, they ran out of things to say, and so they started playing the chicken dance music over Ryan Braun's at-bats because he has a tendency to flare out his elbows.
Yeah, it helps when you're doing a recent game. You can get a lot of things on YouTube and other places. I just wrote up the 2013 World Series games, but now I'm working on the 1903 ones, and there's no YouTube available from those 1903 games. So, I don't know what happened that year, but just no YouTube available. So that's pretty good. I enjoyed hearing all the stories myself. I hope folks, there might be folks here who are, including some of the authors, partisans of the of other teams. And of course, you can read about your other favorite team if it's not the Brewers, how they fared in some of their bigger blowouts. Anybody have any questions for different authors or anybody?
Yeah, I've got a question. Mike Kerry here. It's interesting in the MLB standings, they like to put the run differential in the last few years. Not quite sure when that started. Does anybody know if that has really an impact on what I'm going to call any middle average teams? Obviously, the team that wins the division is obviously always going to have more runs than they've given up. But it's interesting that these blowout games, does any of that kind of impact that?
You mean they put in for the year total, the run differential?
Yeah, that's that.
Yeah.
If you go to the MLB.com standings every day, they list that, and it obviously updates with each game. But it's interesting where you know, hey, we beat somebody 20-2, because like the Brewers this year had that big win over the Tigers and then couldn't score a run, and they actually had a negative run differential, I believe, at the end of the year.
Well, we came close to having a team in the World Series that had a negative winning record this year in
exactly with the Astros.
So weird things can happen from time to time.
Well, because that was this season.
Yeah. Well, the run differential is sometimes used because there's that Pythagorean theorem, and if the run differential is skewed, it'll say it's a lucky team. The team got lucky because their
the
run differential
win percentage.
Right. Yeah.
Well, whenever I think of run differential, I always think of the 1960 World Series.
Bingo.
With it's one of baseball's iconic moments. But I don't have the stats in front of me, but the Yankees actually outscored the Pirates. In that it was sort of like in the Yankees wins, they were just demolished, but then the Pirates won all of the close ones and the one that mattered ultimately. So
yeah, one run's enough to make the difference in Game 7, right?
Absolutely. And rain delays.
Yeah. As a Brewer fan, we wouldn't know what that 1-run difference in the 7th game would be like. So
that's true.
There's a couple of comments out on the chats. Congratulations, Bill, on your 50th anniversary. And as you responded, 50th year and 2 days of the founding of Rounder Records. Thank you, Tom Hawthorne, for bringing that up. And then Tom Hawthorne also mentioned that you could describe the game as right up there with the ugliest. So, yeah.
And that could be true from either perspective, depending. I mean, if you're a Brewers fan, sure. I mean, it's kind of fun, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a certain element that some other people you might appreciate a different kind of game sometimes.
Yeah, and in fact, there was the Toronto fans kind of got into a bit of a ironic behavior. Famously, Skydome is attached to a hotel, and a fan in the hotel was seen leaning out on the balcony with a noose around his neck. and when the Brewers finally went out, when their 27th out was recorded in the top of the ninth, the Toronto fans booed because they wanted more runs for Milwaukee. It's such a cliche, but a true one. One of the absolute delights about baseball is you can go to a ball game and see something that you've never seen before, or perhaps has never happened in the history of Major League Baseball. So I think in Toronto, they kind of had that very dark humor in the late innings, like, come on, Milwaukee, score more runs. Like, roll this up. Let's make me keep my ticket stub here.
The year did end okay for the Blue Jays.
Yeah, it certainly did.
I have a question for any of the authors or contributors regarding the timing of these blowouts. Is there a time of the season or a portion of the season where it's more likely to see a blowout than another?
It doesn't seem to be. In the introduction to the book, I did look at it by month, and of the 120 games in the month, there were 30 of them, 20 were in April, 14 were in May, 20 were in June, 23 were in July, 18 in August, 21 in September, and 11 in October, though those were most of the postseason games that we included. So it's a pretty even spread. Mm-hmm. The 1 month that was the lowest was May, but I mean, it must just have been coincidental. So I don't think that's any standard, differential there.
Thanks.
It was just odd that there were two of the games. I mean, there's 120 games there. Two of them happened on the exact same date. And I just, when I realized that's why I started looking to see what other things there might be. That May 20th, 1994, the Mariners beat the Rangers 19-2. And on that very same day, the Twins beat the Red Sox 21-2. In both cases, the winning team was playing at home, which has got to be a little more fun than having it happen on the road. But
although the dark humor on the road starts quicker, like in Toronto. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I've been at a few games where my team didn't come out so well, and I've seen that same kind of behavior, sarcastic cheering and so forth for something that happens to your own team. Whatever.
Well, you mentioned the 2 in the 1 day. Didn't we have like 5 games this year that had 10 or more runs in it on one day?
Was it that many? There were quite a few lopsided games this year. A couple would have made the book if we'd held the book for another year. Oh, those are such an asterisk year anyhow. I don't know.
Yeah. One of the comments, I'm not sure who said this, maybe Tom, is that if you haven't written, do a games project. It's, a lower number of words, and it's very interesting. And listening to the writers, they just didn't write about a game. What did you also see in the game? And that their passion for their game was what really makes the story. And so when you go and look at a games and you do a games project, it's a good way to get started with the SABR project, getting to know the editors and the fact checkers. And trust me, I've been fact checked to death. And and the first time it happened to me, it shocked me. And now I learned, I just have to get much better. So it was really good training. But it's a great way to do it. And these are all interesting games. So
I may have only written 2 or 3 games where where an error wasn't found. And it's not that I'm trying to be lazy and let the fact checkers do the work for me. I just make mistakes. I'm glad I don't work for a daily newspaper because it could be embarrassing.
Yeah. And this comes from the person who has written over 700 SABR project books, so articles and a number of books. So yeah, don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's what the editors are out there, and they'll help you learn.
Right, and we try to help first-time authors, and it's always nice to me to see somebody come forward. A games project way is the way to begin. You can pick any obscure game you want. It doesn't have to be a big and meaningful game. One of the first ones I wrote up was simply the game I first took my son to when he was 6 weeks old. There was nothing at all unusual about the game. I just wanted to write it up so someday, if he ever cared, he could read about the first game he ever went to. And so, I mentioned that in a PS at the end. It wasn't part of the game story, but you can say, yes, somebody came up and they got a double, somebody else came up and singled them home. You want to tell the story of the game, but the context can be really interesting as well. Was it somebody's first game with the team? David Cohn, was his, it could be any number of things going on, an independent race, or it could be a very early season game that turned out to mean nothing at all, and you have to find some other story. If you find somebody that was 104 years old that can say something about it, that's a pretty good angle.
Yeah. Just imagine if the difference between being a SABR writer and a ball player is you're a SABR writer and somebody hits a lazy, soft two-hopper to you at second base and you boot it in SABR. The fact checker is going to catch that, hopefully. So there's no E on the scoreboard. So it would be as if in baseball, you could just let's have a do-over, a mulligan here on that ground ball. So it is incredible how many errors can happen. Like even in a 1,200 word piece, the articles for this book, think of how many names are in every one of those entries. Any one of those names could be misspelled. You can get it's so easy to just make a mistake. And it is one of the really things I've enjoyed as a writer, professional writer, working with the SABR people, is the peer reviewing and the fact checking. It actually eases the pressure. I spend a long time sometimes on these things. Errors are inevitable. It happens. Typos can be in there, boneheaded mistakes. Maybe you've made an assumption because you remember it. I saw it. It must have been that way. And it is a great thing to have the SABR fact checking and copy editing. I think Len, is he a Levine or Levin? Len Levin was a longtime career copy editor, and his work shows. He really just gives you a beautiful polish.
Yeah, he worked for the Providence Journal for decades, and he has, I think, copy edited almost every single SABR book that we've put out. I mean, it's just, and this is all volunteer work. It's not like we're highly paid practitioners or something like that. It's all volunteer work, and some of us enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, and sometimes just the little, talking about elements that are just kind of relegated to notes from the games that don't actually deal with on the field. I wrote about Game 2 of the 1918 World Series, where the Cubs actually played at Comiskey Park. And one of the fun little stories that I found is a little story about 3 boys who had saved up money to buy 1 seat for all 3 games that were going to be at Comiskey Park. And the boy who actually went to the Cubs office to buy them lost them on the train. And they never made it home. And the parents went back and took the kids back to the ballpark and said, my son lost it. And they said, don't worry, these boys will be taken care of. There was a police officer waiting at that seat at Comiskey Park that said, gentlemen, I don't believe that's your seat. And here are the boys that had it. So they ended up getting to go after all of that. And it was just one of those little 3-liner notes that wound up buried at the bottom of a story that it was just absolute gold to discover. So.
Steve Schmidt, you had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to say, because Bill and I have done the fact-checking thing back and forth, and I found a new way to screw up that I have to cure myself of. And I realized what was happening is, even when I go back and try to review for a final draft, and I'm looking at, say, a series of seasons, whether it's minor league or major league statistics, with the scrolling you have to do on some computers that don't have a very big screen, you can misread one line And that's when you really need the fact checker, because I had that happen with my last one where, oh, I thought I was reading his 1939 games played, and I got the 1938 games played. And I think part of it for me is the old habit of I like to have hold a thing in my hand and look at it. But then we're all getting more accustomed to doing everything on the computer and doing it as fast as we can. And sometimes we try to do it as fast as we can, and then we don't realize the mistake that we're making.
A suggestion for games project, and it's an idea I have for myself, I haven't gotten around to it yet, is all the games on when the day I was born.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Luckily, I was
born on the 26th of December. I can't.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. Although the 1960 championship game in the Packers and the Eagles, well, you know. But I thought of another blowout game as I was listening, and a friend of mine and his dad went to Wrigley Field July 4 of 1977 when the Cubs were in first place, and that was a game they lost to the Expos 19-3. Don Stanhouse, a pitcher, hit a grand slam home run, and Larry Bittner ended up pitching for the Cubs.
Wow. Any other questions on this book? Because I'd like to have a few minutes to talk about Bill's other book, The Working a Perfect Game, which was about a 4-year project where Bill interviewed 72 major league umpires, a couple dozen AAA umpires, and 4 umpire supervisors. It sounds like a fascinating book. So if there's any other questions, other questions on this book, fine. Otherwise, Bill, can you talk about your umpires book?
Sure. And anybody, I think, could email any one of us if you come up with a question later, if you're reading the Blowouts book. This is what this book looks like. I don't know if you can see it that well. It's just a book. Yeah. Working a Perfect Game. Because Mike Randazzo told me, he's one of the 76 major league umpires. He said the thing that he always looks forward to is working a perfect game. And I said, well, of course, anybody would want to work a perfect game. I'd love to see one myself. I've seen 4 or 5 no-hitters, but I've never seen a perfect game. He said, no, that's not what I mean. And he explained, and it was pretty interesting to me. A perfect game, and that's why I put it in quotation marks in the title, Working a Perfect Game. A perfect game for an umpire is a game where there are no known mistakes, no call for a replay, but also the umpire has worked the game and felt that he did it the best that he could do, that he was in the right position to make the right call at the right time. One of the things that first impressed me when I started interviewing all these umpires, I would basically waylay them as they came into the game. Most of them had no idea I was going to approach them and ask to do an interview, but I'd wait for them outside the umpire's room. They usually get in about an hour and a half before the game, and I have a press pass for Fenway Park, so I just go in and wait for them, and then they'd show up and say, can I talk to you for a few minutes, maybe tomorrow night? Like if it's a Friday night, I'd say, I'm here for the whole weekend. Maybe we can spare 10 or 15 minutes tomorrow. And almost everyone agreed to, not necessarily the same day, but Trip Gibson, I think I met him in Boston, I met him in New York, and I met him in one other city. And then finally we caught up again in Boston. It just, they had family or whatever. It didn't work out until I thought he was putting me off, and he said, no. And finally it worked. We sat down on a piece of ground screw equipment underneath the stands and talked for about half an hour. But the umpires that I started talking to impressed me with how dedicated they really were. Someone mentioned one of the players talking about essentially the integrity of the game, respecting the game. And the impression I got was that many of these umpires truly believe that. It's not just a job for them. If you wanted to pick a job, you could pick an easier job to get into. The average umpire takes about 8 years to make the major leagues. And that's 8 years of getting paid maybe $15,000 a year. I mean, you don't get paid anything in the minor leagues. Pay is pretty good once you get to the major leagues and you've got a certain kind of tenure and job tenure and so forth, but they didn't get there haphazardly. They've had to be graded and evaluated every single game along the way. Every single game they get a grade on. And that's what the supervisors do, and umpire observers that they have that are at AAA games in particular. They're really, look at these guys that are on the verge of making it. And I talked to umpires who told me that they lost sleep over a call that they made that was correct. Say you're at first base, very close play. You made the call, it was the correct call, but the umpire realized he was out of position. He should have been, maybe the guy rounded first, dove back into the bag or something like that. The throw came in. And the umpire wasn't in the best position he could have been in. He should have been maybe 5 feet off to the right or 5 feet off to the left. And he's faulting himself, even though the call was right. Maybe the call went to replay and he was deemed correct. Maybe it didn't go to replay, but he knew that he could have made a better call. So that wasn't the perfect game because he was out of position, even though the call was correct. So that's basically where the title came from.
Okay, all right.
That said, that some of the umpires, it's not like they know every single thing that happens in a game. Maybe I'm getting off on too much of a tangent there, but I did find that many times umpires will tell you if you were to approach them an hour and a half after the game, 2 hours of the game, and ask them what the score was, they could not tell you. If you were a fan, you went to the game, well, you could probably remember what the score was, but they weren't really focused on the score. They were focused on individual plays. I joked with some of them that I bet you could tell whether the team played in the bottom of the ninth inning or not, because that has to do with, these games are going off over 3 hours, and it was 3 hours and 4 minutes I just read was the average game this year. If you're going to work the bottom of the ninth inning or have that 1/18 of the game off, you probably could remember which team won the game. Plus, there's also the hoopla in the ballpark too. But they couldn't necessarily know it was a 6-1 game or a 4-2 game, something of that sort. Probably if it was 20-0, they might remember that. But there are, plenty of instances where they worked a no-hitter and they didn't know it till the 8th inning, even the plate umpire. They just, realized there was something going on, some extra frisson in the ballpark, and they look up at the scoreboard. Oh, the team doesn't have any hits. Usually they know, but not necessarily until it gets there. They're watching other things and trying to pay attention to other things. It's really interesting to me to get to know, to the extent I did, some of these guys. Some of them, it was a 5-year project actually, and so some of them I've known for as long as 5 years. It started with work on a book that you can all download if you haven't already this afternoon, the SABR book of umpires and umpiring. That came out 3 years ago. It's available for you right now on the SABR website. And I worked on that with Larry Gerlach, who was probably SABR's greatest expert on umpires. And so he became kind of a mentor to me in working on this later book as well. Every single interview I did, I sent to him and asked him if he had any idea for follow-up questions. And he was just great to, I had said, I'm going to have a chance to talk to Tim Timmons finally tomorrow. Any questions you think I should ask him? And he often had an idea for a question I might ask. Tim Timmons was kind of interesting. When I interviewed him, he was working replay. I'd seen him twice at Fenway Park, and both times he had family or friends visiting. We started talking once, and like 2 minutes into it, he gets a knock on the umpire's room door and they said, so-and-so is here, and I got to go because I got to bring the tickets up to my friend or something like that. So we finally ended up talking. He was working in New York replay, and we did the interview as he walked from his hotel to the replay operations center. Got a 20-minute interview, but I can still hear a car horn honk every so often in the background or something, hear a little commotion going on, maybe as he's waiting for the light to change or something. But it was a great interview, actually, a really good interview. Some were better than others. They have all kinds of individual stories as to how they got into umpiring. Some of them, Hunter Wendelstedt, some of you may know. His father was Harry Wendelstedt. That's how he got into umpiring, little clue there from the last name. Mike DeMuro and his son Lou DeMuro, or his father Lou DeMuro, Brian Gorman, his father was Tom Gorman. So there are a few multi-generational umpires. A couple of them, I think the Wilkie brothers are like 10 years apart from each other, but they both got into umpiring, Bill Wilkie and Tim Wilkie. And then Jeff Kellogg married one of their sisters. So he's the brother-in-law of two major league umpires. And the three of them were all major league umpires at the same time at one point there. That's a pretty astonishing situation, all from Michigan. But some of them, I mean, one of them told me he had no idea even what umpiring was about until he ended up umpiring a game. Just happened that way. Who was it? I can remember the stories better than I can remember which person connects with which story sometimes. But one of them told me that his mother was, I think it was Doug Eddings. His mother ran Little League. Yeah, it was Doug. He's from New Mexico, and his mother actually ran the Little League down there. And there was a game that the umpires didn't show up. And he was like, I think maybe 12 years old or something at the time, and it was a 10-year-old's game or something. His mother told him, "You're umpiring the game." And he said, "I am not." And she said, "You are. There's no choice in the matter, Miss young Doug." And so he umpired the game, and he said he kind of enjoyed it. And then she told him he got $20 too for working the game, because that's what they paid Little League umpires that year. So, oh, okay. He just, a lot of them get hooked. They have experience. They get a couple people. One guy dared a friend of his to go to umpire school. He said, "I'm going to umpire school." And where's that? It's in Florida. And here it is in January. And he was from Michigan. So, okay, I'll go to Florida for January. But it was on a dare. And he ended up becoming a major league umpire after putting in all those years of work. And you got to be really dedicated to want to do that. It's not like umpires are, as was noted, most of my business career was in the music business. You know, you get up on stage, you have thousands of people cheering for you. That doesn't happen with umpires. They're at the game. There's a lot of people at the game, but they're not all there cheering the umpires. In fact, if anything, you may never hear an umpire get cheered. You get a few boos, a few, kill the ump or whatever like that. Not so much as you used to, because replay takes a lot of the really questionable calls just get taken off the table and get resolved more correctly than before through the replay arrangement. But they prefer their anonymity. That's another thing that goes into a perfect game, is a game where no umpire stands out. No umpire has become the focus of attention because the plays are made smoothly, handled smoothly, called correctly. And there's just no controversy that comes out. When I was working on the book, at one point, I thought of giving it a different title. Umpires are people too. That's what I was thinking of calling it, because there is this impression, I've told this story a couple of times about, and I'm guilty of it myself too. Umpires come out of a hole in the ground. They're all dressed the same. They go out there and they work pretty much anonymously, and then they go back into a hole in the ground. You could, in most instances, bump into a major league umpire a half an hour before or after a game, and you wouldn't know who he was. If I ran into David Ortiz a half an hour after a game, I'd know who he was. Okay, some players are a little more stand out than others. Maybe, I don't know, Corey Seager, if I ran into him, I wouldn't recognize him. But it's, I don't know, they all have parents, families, they all have different backgrounds, and some of them, I did ask almost every one of them what they thought they would have done if they hadn't gone into umpiring, or if they hadn't stuck with it. And there's a wide variety of responses there too. Several said law enforcement. A couple of them, Vic Carapazza was an MP in the armed services before he became an umpire. Maybe not bad training. Ed Hickox was one of the umpires that he had just started working in 1999 when all that year, all the umpires decided to resign in mass resignation as part of a labor bargaining tactic. It didn't work because Major League Baseball accepted all their resignations. So he was suddenly out of a job. Here he was. He worked his way all the way up, got hired as a major league umpire, and 2 months into it, he went along with everybody else. His father was a metal worker, as I recall, and he in a union factory, and so he wasn't about to buck the union, but it cost him his job, and he worked his way back again. After he was out for several years, he told himself he became a policeman. That's how I got onto this part of the story. He became a policeman in Florida, so he actually carries a gun, not on the field, but in the job he's working right now. He's not on the World Series crew. So he's in Florida now working as a detective for one of the police departments down there. But that's what he would have done had he not gone back and gone up another 3 or 4 years back to AA and AAA to work his way back into the majors and make it again on his own. There are, I think, 3 different umpires that took that same route. Tom Hallion was another one, and Bruce Davidson, I think, was the third one, that had resigned, been out of it for several years, and decided, no, I want to get back into that. And that's dedication too, to be willing to do that. How about, we're probably going on a little longer than some people expected. And I could talk forever, but I think maybe people may have some questions about umpires or umpiring, which I'd be happy to take later, but if there's time, and you've got some right now, maybe we could do that. Dennis, what do you think?
Yes,
I know you're
please,
anxious.
we got members still on, and there's no one after us waiting for the time. So if you want to have questions, please do.
Yes.
I was just going to suggest, because I was at the convention in San Diego, and Jerry Davis was part of a panel on umpiring. And so one thing that could be something that could even add to the experience of this book is to go back and view that, because he had talked about some of the things involved and what it really took to be an umpire. And then there was the game that all of us who were there for the convention went to, where the same umpire had 3 calls overturned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a different umpire, but it was that game. I went to London to see the Red Sox and Yankees play over the first games ever in Europe, and so I missed that convention. But it was Vic Carapazza was the first base umpire, I think, that game. And yeah, 3 calls, all challenged, all overturned. I mean, talk about, embarrassment. I did not want to ask him about that game. Unfortunately, I didn't do it beforehand. But, his father-in-law was Richie Garcia, and he was one of the umpires. He was the head of the union, kind of. And he was one of the umpires that resigned and did not get his job back again. But so he's sort of had umpiring in the family, and he didn't get fired. Major league umpires, once they get there, as I said, they do have a kind of job tenure. They do get graded, and they all end up in the 90s with balls and strikes, 96, 97% correct calls. I suppose eventually, if somebody started really screwing up, they would figure out a way to do it. But I didn't. I should go back and look at that game myself on YouTube and see how close those calls were. Close enough that they all got challenged, but talk about embarrassing. That was probably his unhappiest game.
Bill, talking about replay, what's the opinion of the umpires you talk to about replay?
I think it's changed over time. I think that I don't know this for sure. I think a lot of them didn't want it at first, maybe took a little umbrage and thought it could embarrass them to show that they were wrong. Now, of course, if they thought about it for a minute, they were already being shown that they were wrong on television broadcasts, but this would codify it. And they're not wrong most of the time. Most of the time they're right. The only calls that get challenged are ones that are close calls. All the other calls that aren't challenged are because they're either so obviously correct. The guy's 10 feet out trying to get to first base, and the first baseman's already thrown the ball around the infield. But, they are right most of the time. But I think it takes the onus off making a really bad call. And I immediately think about Jim Joyce, who made that call that cost Andres Galarraga a perfect game. 2 outs in the 9th inning, he called the base runner safe, the batter safe at first base, and there was no replay. So the next batter made an out, and okay, it was within 5 minutes of being back in the umpire's room, he had watched a television broadcast rerun, and he knew he was wrong. And he immediately talked to the pool reporter and admitted it. He said, I blew that call. I was wrong. I feel really bad. I cost the kid a perfect game. And I mean, I remember at the time thinking that the commissioner should simply declare it a perfect game. It was a perfect game. He threw a perfect game. The umpire made a bad call on what turned out to be a meaningless call at the end of the game because the next batter was out anyhow. Who would have gotten upset? I don't know. Maybe some statistician someplace would have, but it would be making things correct, making things the way they actually were, and just voiding one unnecessary call. He didn't do that. And the two people involved, Jim Joyce and Andres Galarraga, got together and wrote a book called Nobody's Perfect. And that's true as human beings. I mean, maybe some people throw perfect games. Maybe some umpires work what they call a perfect game, but nobody actually is perfect. It's, I don't know, it was a very impressive book. You'd think that, I don't know, I found it from every perspective a very interesting book to read about how they reconciled it with each other and how they became, in fact, somewhat friendly, respectful of each other, worked on the book together, and impressive book.
Hey guys, I'm just curious if anybody else follows on Twitter umpire scorecards. It's kind of an interesting little thing that they kick out where every game, well, not every game, but like with the World Series and playoffs, they score every umpire. And so like last night was behind home plate here. Bill Miller gave him a 96% accuracy, yet on Wednesday night, it was Todd Tishner. They gave him an 89% on balls and strikes, and his big thing was on the inside zone. They claimed he was only 75% accurate. So kind of a interesting thing to play with or look at if you're into any of that. It's called umpire scorecards on Twitter.
I didn't know about that. I'll check it out right after we're finished here. And
yeah, it's an interesting little thing just to look after the fact.
And Chris Guccione is working the game tonight, so I'll see how he does. He's the umpire that took the longest to make the major leagues. He worked something like 1,300 games, major league games, as a call-up umpire, officially AAA, but not yet promoted to the major league staff. In 1,300 games, and think about that. You've got a 160 game season. That's almost, well, it's 9 years, almost 10 years, if you want to think of it that way, of apprenticeship before there was finally an opening and he got hired. Some of those, the typical major league umpire works about 120 games, given vacation time and things of that sort. And that gives them time off during a season where they have to, I mean, there's just 4 of them. They don't travel with the whole team. They don't have all these friends to hang out with. They don't tend to socialize that much with certainly people in the game, but other people too. I mean, they'd rather people didn't know they were umpires most of the time. A couple of funny anecdotes. One of them was in a hotel elevator an hour and a half after the game. And so he was going up to his room, and I think it was like, I think for some reason, I think it was Cubs fans, but I might be wrong. A couple of fans got into the elevator and they're griping about the game. And so the umpire said, what about that second base umpire? I thought he was really bad. And he was obviously the guy that worked second base. If I ever see him, I'd just punch him, wouldn't you? And they said, yeah. And the guy was there with one of his friends who was like, oh, be careful here, what you're doing. They were just goofing on the fans. But, they really don't want to be recognized for more than one reason.
Mike Hopper's got an interesting comment out here. Interesting that we think an umpire is inferior when he's 75% right, but we pay a hitter $30 million a year to be right 27.5% of the time.
Right. A 300 hitter is someone that fails 70% of the time, and they become multimillionaires. Yeah. Not too many jobs like that. Any accountants out there? Any people that do tax prep and screw up 70% of the time? Yeah.
One other question for you, Bill. There's a charity called Umps Care that, from what I understand, goes to like children's hospitals and gives kids bears and stuffed animals, stuff like that. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, most of them are very active in that, and some of the umpire wives are very actively involved in that as well. I was at the winter meetings a couple of years ago, and it was I think four of the different wives had set up a booth there. Umps Care, but there's an auction every year. Anybody can join it. You may have notice of it, but you can have a lunch with an ump if you want. If you're the winning bidder, it costs you over $1,000. I see, but you can have lunch with an ump and talk about whatever you want to talk about, I guess. But they have other things that are much more affordable than that. Players might donate to raise money for the charity. But mostly they bring kids to ball games. They bring disadvantaged kids, and then they'll meet with them before the game and say hi to them, and then give them a couple of things and so forth. Sometimes they visit children's hospitals. It's pretty much child-oriented, helping maybe kids get a little more interested in baseball than some kids might otherwise. It's a pretty nice charity, I think. There were two or three of them for a while, but they've all kind of consolidated in Umps Care.
What do the umpires say, if anything, about the change from National League and American League umpires to working both leagues?
Well, this goes back 20 years, of course. So, I mean, since 1999, there have not been such thing as an American League umpire wearing the big chest protector, the balloon protector, or a National League umpire who didn't. A number of the people that I talked to had worked in those days before they were all major league umpires. And I asked them if there were certain sort of rivalries between, American League's better or the National League's better. And yeah, they kind of had joking rivalries. And every once in a while, I guess one of them might get a little worked up about it, maybe after they had a few drinks or something like that. But mostly it was just friendly rivalry and so forth. Our team's better because it's our team. But I think that now, I mean, clearly we have different games in the National League and the American League with the DH, and so there are different aspects that go into each game. If you're going to pull a double switch and so forth, the home plate umpire's got to pay much more attention to his own score sheet as to who's legitimately in the game and who isn't and where they are in the order. It's more work involved. I don't know how much longer we're going to have that. We'll see.
Comment out here also from Blake.
Yeah,
I recommend. Pardon me?
That's a good book. Bruce Weber's book, As They See Him. Bruce Weber was, I think he worked for the New York newspaper, one of them, maybe the New York Times, but I think he went for much of a year traveling with umpires. And had a chance.
He also went, he went to the school as well as part of like kind of a immersion plan of being an umpire. But he focused a lot on the culture. He did walk away with that, having such respect for the fact that the umps just want to get the call right. And it was really enjoyable. Actually, our Columbus chapter, we also have a book club there. He joined us via phone call as part of our book club. So it was a really good read into the culture of umpiring in that really tough road that they go, that you can invest 10 years and never make it to the major leagues.
Yeah, I went to umpire school for 3 days. I didn't take part in it the way he did, but just that look was very impressive to me, to see the field work and as well as the classroom work that they do and what's expected of them in both environments. And they're paying money to go to the school, of course, so they're paying attention, but they really were working away at it, and the curriculum, the way it was presented and so forth, was very very much dedicated towards respect for the game. You know, you talk to some people and ask them sort of a question. You're going to get canned answers sometimes, but I talked to these people. Bruce did far more than I did, spent much more time than I did with any of the people I've talked to even though some of them I've talked to on multiple occasions. You know, you could say, oh yes, we really care about this, but you really become convinced that they do, that it's not just a job. A lot of people have jobs that's just a job and they get by and they're really not into their job for one reason or another. Some of us have been fortunate enough to have jobs that we really care about, and you get weeded out from being an umpire. And one of the guys I sit near at Fenway Park is Kevin O'Connor. He was at our 2002 convention when we had the SABR convention in Boston. That's when I got to know him. He is an umpire observer. And so he's one of the people who is there grading umpires. He spends most of his time working AAA. It was Pawtucket up until this year. Next year, if they have a minor leagues season next year, it will be with the Worcester Red Sox. But he'll be watching the different teams that come through Worcester and grading the prospective umpires. But he wanted to be an umpire. He put in 5 or 6 years, and then he just looked at the ages of the people above him and their health. And he said, you know, this could be another 5 or 6 years. There might be 10 or 12 years. I just can't, you know, I've got a wife now. I've got to get more serious about things. So he got into real estate, and he's made a success of himself working in real estate. So now this umpire work is sort of gravy, what he really enjoys doing. But he had to leave. Just couldn't hack it any longer. And there's a couple of umpires that I interviewed that were AAA umpires on the way up that I noticed have not come back. And I'm you know, reluctant to reach out and ask them why, because, you know, they may be unhappy about having put in 5 or 6 years, and there may have been something maybe they got a signal that, you know, you're not on the fast track. And, you know, I just didn't want to go back and ask them. I am kind of curious about this pandemic year. One of the things, as soon as the World Series is over, I've already talked to a couple of the guys, and I got to go back and try to do with Fred Rogers, who was he presented that umpires panel in San Diego. He and I are going to work together and try to put together a piece about how umpires handled the pandemic. One thing I learned that this year there's 4 umpires in Houston that are not working the games. They're just there in case they need to be there. They're just there. They're staying in the hotel, and they are ready in case we hear that there's some kind of COVID scare and 3 or 4 of the umpires or they all have to stop working. The whole crew has to stop. These other guys will come in.
You mentioned, Bill, how tough it is. I'm wearing my Mallard stuff today. It's our 20th season. I bought this to celebrate the 20th season. I had nowhere to go with it. So I thought, I'm wearing this today. You know, I'm going to a meeting. But the umpires in the Northwoods League went to umpire school and did not get hired by the minor leagues. So they're now in the College Development League. So now they're starting even further down, making probably even worse money. And so that grind for them, and some of these umpires are pretty lousy. Well, they're brand new. They're kids just out of umpire school, you know, and if fans would scream at them, I thought, these guys are learning too, you know, give them a break. But yeah, you're right. It's a tough grind.
Well, a typical class of umpire school is going to be maybe 100, 120 people, and only 2 or 3 of them, they say only 1 or 2 will ever make the majors. But they're not all there to make the majors. Some are there because they thought it would be interesting. Their aspiration is really to work college games. They're not wanting to become a full-time umpire. It's just something that they know they would enjoy doing. And so the fact that some of them don't get hired, they know that going in, that it's a long shot, but they don't all leave sorely disappointed.
Folks, we're at hour and a half here. I don't know how if anyone feels about continuing a little longer. We can go on. I know we're taking up a lot of your Saturday.
I thought you said you were going to the bar, Dennis, afterwards with everybody. You're taking everybody to the bar, right?
Well, what we call bar time is something we started in our meetings. Is after we'd have the meeting part of it, we'd call it, and we back in the days when we had face-to-face meetings, a bunch of us end up at the bar, either swapping lives or telling baseball stories or both. And so that's the one piece we miss with the Zoom meeting. So we kind of opened it up to bar time just to talk about other baseball related things that we probably didn't talk about in the meeting. And since nothing has really been going on in baseball the last, 2 weeks or so, I'm sure there's nothing to talk about other than World Series and playoffs. And so.
Well, thanks very much. I enjoyed the opportunity. I'll hang out for a while here and hear other people talk and so forth, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these couple books I've been involved with.
What I can do is I'm going to turn off the recording now, so we can say anything. So that, but more important, that way it doesn't make the recording that much longer. Anyone wants to hang out and talk baseball, that would be great. So let me turn this off.